today by Mackenzie Wollenzien to talk about the astrology of Pope Francis, RIP. Welcome back, Mackenzie.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to the patrons who voted for this episode. I'm very excited to talk about the Pope because he was built different. He was a little bit of a different Pope than I've ever seen in my lifetime, and it sounds like, the legacy of the Catholic Church anybody has ever seen.
Oh, yeah.
So, definitely an interesting one to dive into. Before we get started, though, I'm going to talk about Pope Francis's astrology. And I like to give this caveat whenever I do anybody's astrology chart. You might have the same placements as Pope Francis. You could even have the same damn chart, and it doesn't mean that you're really anything like Pope Francis. There might be shades of similarity, but if I say something today about a certain placement, I'm talking about Pope Francis. I'm not talking about you. So try not to take it to heart. And I'm really happy to be joined by Mackenzie for this one. Mackenzie is the Petty Astrology Catholic correspondent.
Yes. I was born and raised Catholic.
Yes,
It's a culture. It's like a different culture in its own way, I feel like.
it is. And, in the United States, like, there's not as many Catholics as there are in other parts of the world. And I think the count right now is like 1.4 billion people in the world identify as Catholic, which is kind of
Wow.
wild. Yeah, that's a
That's a
lot of.
lot.
Yeah. So, I'm not a Catholic person. I've never been Catholic. I didn't have the privilege of being raised, with the the beauty and the legacy of the Catholic Church. And so I didn't get the
Hmm.
Catholic guilt. I got the Protestant guilt. And I did do 2 years in Catholic school. Get this. I went to a Baptist school before that, and I really wanted to leave the school because it was so strict that the Catholic school that I went to for 2 years at the end of high school was actually a relief to me. I was
Oh
like,
my God.
these Catholics, at least they drink and dance because
Oh, yeah.
I could not handle the Baptists anymore. So, shout out to 2 years at Bishop Alemany. I learned a lot about being Catholic in the United States from that time in my life.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's just really fascinating for me as like a ex-evangelical child, to contrast and compare the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism because, they're both Christianity, but like Protestants really look at Catholics down their nose. They're really snobby about it, actually. Like those papists.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so funny.
It's so kind of silly. Like if you get down to it, it's like we're all Christian, and they're like, "Are we really?"
Hmm. It's like there's a hierarchy.
There completely is a hierarchy. Protestants are very like they really anything that has to do with Jesus, and it's not the way that they kind of view Jesus. It's kind of a side eye type of thing. So it's pretty funny,
Hmm.
but there are a lot of differences between Catholicism. So I'm happy to have you here because I'm sure that you're gonna be able to clarify some things.
Oh God. That was a long time ago. We'll see. We'll see.
I think only like a minority of Christians in the United States are Catholics, and like even in terms of United States history, like it's been a big deal that JFK when he was elected, like the fact that
Hmm.
he was a Catholic was a really huge deal, and there people were like thinking, is he going to be loyal to the country or is he going to be loyal to the Pope?
Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, and so one of the main differences between Protestants and Catholics is like there is no single figurehead for Protestants the way that the
Mm.
Pope is the figurehead for Catholics. And so you can see why very Protestant heavy America there is this like suspicion of Catholics. And I don't recall it ever being an issue when Biden came around who's also Catholic.
Yeah.
I think we've kind of gotten over that as a country, it seems.
Uh-huh.
We don't care if they're papists anymore, I guess. So
I guess.
it's kind of fascinating, but to think of like the role, just the role of a pope and having authority over 1.4 billion people of all,
Hmm.
races, nationalities, it's like a tremendous amount of power. And I think in like 2025, if you're not Catholic, you might underestimate the meaning of like being a pope. And, less people now are into traditional religion maybe than they were before. So I think people
Hmm.
can kind of downplay the power of the pope. But like, tell me, like, as a Catholic young person, like, what was it like having a pope? Like, what did the pope mean to you as a young person?
It was kind of like our religious king in a way,
Hmm.
like for real. Like that was like, and we prayed to the Pope every day and like pray for the Pope. And I mean, we were taught that like what the Pope says, like it's basically like God's mouth,
Right.
basically. And um to really like take what the Pope says as like, word of God. And so, I mean, you never question the Pope, at least not when I was that age. But yeah, just a very like special person in our church, obviously, and someone that you look up to and you kind of like idolize in a way.
Mhm.
But yeah.
Yeah, it's just a very different thing from those of us who didn't grow up Catholic. Like, from a Protestant perspective, it's funny because, we're saying this in 2025, and at least in the United States, a lot of Protestants are, have been roped into the conservative movement, and we're really not supposed to look up to any man, like a human being,
Hmm.
in the way that we look to like God.
Yeah, that is interesting.
When I watched that Wim Wenders documentary about the Pope, it's called Pope Francis, A Man of His Word. We both watched it
Yeah.
in preparation for this episode. It was really great to see like clips of him, just talking about his ministry and his beliefs, really. And apparently, considering, we've had several popes since, you could take a recording, of them. And this is the most interviewed and like interacted with by the public pope that we've ever had. So we have a lot more documentation, video and stuff of him and his access to him than we've had for like other popes, which I think is really interesting considering how I think in general, I think you can comment on Pope Francis as he was a different kind of pope. And I think one of the things that sets him apart from previous popes is that he really feels like Christ-like in a way and like a man of the
Yeah.
people. The way that I watched him interacting with regular people, the humility was really evident and it just really felt human to human
Hmm.
in a way. So I feel like that is really reflected in at least what I've seen of Pope Francis. But in that documentary, there was a nun who was talking about Pope Francis and said that his life was a sermon. God sends us the Pope that we need for each stage of the earth. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective from obviously a Catholic person, a nun, that,
Hmm.
from their perspective, God has chosen this leader of the church for this particular time. And I think that Pope Francis's popedom is really reflective of the times that we're in and a lot of the social issues that are really coming to light. So let's talk about his astrology. He was a Cancer rising and he was a Sagittarius sun, Capricorn Mercury. He had an Aquarius Venus and moon, and he was a Libra Mars. And he was born December 17th, 1936. So he really lived a nice long life. Like he got his Uranus return, which,
Yeah.
not everybody gets that 84-year return. So anybody to me that has lived to the Uranus return is like, that's a good long life.
Oh yeah.
He was born in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and he had a pretty big family. I believe he was the eldest of, I think, like five or six siblings. So, big family.
Hmm.
And what's kind of funny to me, haha, is that Pope Francis, one of the firsts of Pope Francis is that he was the first Latin American, first Southern Hemisphere and the first pope born or raised outside of Europe since the 8th century. Yeah,
Crazy.
there was a Syrian pope in the 8th century. But beyond that, we really haven't seen a non-European pope in a really long time.
Oh yeah.
But he had this big family, and they're Italian. He was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio, uh, and his family, from all I could tell, is very Italian. I think both sides of his family super Italian. They grew up in a neighborhood, I think, that had a lot of Italian people in it, and he grew up speaking Spanish and Italian. So the connection, I think, between Pope Francis and his European ancestry, his Italian ancestry, we've had a lot of Italian popes. So I kind of found it funny that he was like a loophole Italian pope.
I know. Yes.
We get this Argentinian pope, but he's Italian. But he
Hmm.
is somebody, I think, that the fact that he was raised where he was and around the people that he was, I think you can see that in his life and in his ministry.
Hmm.
And so one of the things that I noticed, he's got his Cancer Pluto in that first house. It's retrograde. And reportedly, he had some very serious illness that he recovered from. I actually think he got part of his lung removed early in
Yes.
life. Apparently, that allowed him to kind of think about his life a little bit more seriously. And I think it factored into his decision to become a priest. So, thinking about that Pluto in that first house, like, I think he had some pretty serious stuff going on early in his life that led him to contemplate these more serious issues. He actually became an ordained priest in 1969, and eventually he became the Archbishop of Buenos Aires in 98. And then he was made a cardinal in 2001 by Pope John Paul II. He also had a pretty interesting like entry into being the pope because Pope Benedict was his predecessor, and he actually resigned, which is not something that popes do a lot.
No.
Popes choose a name, and he chose his name, Pope Francis, in honor of Saint Francis of Assisi. Did you grow up with the Saint Francis lore?
Oh
Were
yeah.
you a patron of Saint Francis? I feel like you would be.
The school I went to is called St. Francis of Assisi. So
Oh, there you
we
go.
learned all about St. Francis, so I'm very familiar. And yeah, I always liked him because he was very connected to like nature, and
Yeah,
um he could speak to animals supposedly. So I was
right.
like, this my man.
That is the lore that I heard about Francis of Assisi. Is like he was the guy that was like kind of wacky, like talking to animals and just
Hmm.
being a weirdo. Francis of Assisi was also known for living very like simply, and I think that he
Hmm.
kind of gave up everything to go around, and he took a vow of poverty. He became a beggar, and he is, somebody I think that from my non Catholic perspective, he seems like a very influential saint at this point.
Hmm.
Like, a lot of schools are named after him. He's somebody that as a non Catholic I was familiar with. So to me, that tells me
Yeah.
that he's one of the he's one of the big ones, I think. But we hadn't had a Pope Francis before.
Hmm.
He was the first, and I found that interesting because he's associated with animals. He's also associated with the environment. And so I found it interesting that Pope Francis chose to name himself after this person. Like, do you see similarities between the two of them that
Oh yeah.
verify why he picked that name?
So Saint Francis was like supposedly like a mystic, and like very like would write poetry, and like that later became prayers and stuff. And I very much think Pope Francis was like definitely a mystic in his own way. Like looking at his chart, just like there's so many like intuitive markers,
There are.
very, very sensitive, and um, like very connected to the environment. I know he was very like very up and up on like what's going on in the environment, and very passionate about that. And I think that's like a lot of his Aquarius placements, and then he's got
Mhm.
that Uranus in that 10th house. And he really saw like a lot of poverty in his papacy, even like before that. And he saw how global warming affected them like the most. And so
Yeah.
I think maybe that's part of why he chose the name. I don't know.
I think you're right. I think it makes sense to me that there was like this humility and those are things that I think are supposed to be part of like being a pope or being of service in some way.
Hmm.
But it even just seemed to me like even the way he dressed, often he usually was wearing that white vestment that he wears,
Hmm.
and other popes wear that too. But from what I could see, I didn't see all he did. I always saw him very like dressed down compared to previous popes. Like he didn't
Yeah.
really seem to choose to adorn himself too much. And it's interesting too because he's elected in 2013 by this conclave, and after you become pope, there is a papal residence in the Vatican that is set up. And I was reading about this last night because I was so fascinated by the whole thing. And I would love to go visit the Vatican for like historical research at this
Yeah.
point. I'm just like completely fascinated with all of this. But he elected not to live in the papal apartments, and they're nice looking from the pictures that I saw. They're not like, it's not like the gaudiest thing that you could imagine. I'm sure you can imagine like a, Trump gold toilet type of
Oh God,
situation.
yeah.
But they're nice apartments, but it's like a bigger space, and there's rooms for like servants, the people that help him do his thing, and like, his secretary, and there's a dining room. And I was reading about how previous popes would, they would host people. And, really what the pope seems like to me is like the diplomat for the Catholic Church. He's like the head of the
Hmm.
church, but he's also like this ambassador for the church. And the Catholic Church is so interesting because not only is it, a religious institution, but it's almost like a country. Like the Vatican is its own state now.
Hmm.
And it's also like a big company to me. And I've been
Yes.
saying for weeks now, as we've been talking about this, that to me, the Catholic Church is like the original franchise operation. And they so effectively colonized, through establishing these churches around the world and literally participating in colonization.
Hmm.
Like I said at the beginning, I'm not Catholic, so I'm going to be speaking very frankly about like the Catholic Church did some really bad shit, but that is part of how they were able to establish themselves and get to the 1.4 billion people in the world by establishing places in the Americas, the residential schools, which we're hearing a lot about now. And we'll talk
Hmm.
about that more
Hmm.
because Pope Francis had some progressive uh, moments about that as well. But all this to say is that the Catholic Church has an enormous amount of resources, right? So they've got these papal apartments. He could have used these papal apartments because they would use them to like receive guests, and not only would he live there, but it would be a place of like entertaining people. And I don't know in detail like what they do day to day, but they do meet with a lot of like leaders and things like that. So the papal apartments were a place that could like host other people, right? He elected not to live there, and he actually lived. He's dead now.
R.I.P.
R.I.P. Pope Francis actually decided to live in the Domus Sanctae Martyr, which is the guest house. And if you saw the recent movie Conclave, I thought it was interesting because it looked like they actually modeled the way that they filmed that and where the Pope in that movie was living in these apartments as well. So
Hmm.
I found that interesting because that's not, he was the, as far as I know, the first Pope to ever choose not to live in those apartments since they've been there. So that was also, a first for the Catholic Church. But I looked at these apartments, and this whole building was built so when they do these conclaves that all of the cardinals that come in from around the world to do this election have a place to stay. So it's essentially like guest housing.
Hmm.
And that's where he chose to stay. Like he had his room that they assign the rooms for the conclave via lottery, so it's all randomized. He stayed in one of those rooms, and then he got elected pope, and he was like, I'm just going to stay here.
Yeah.
So he stayed there for a minute, and then they moved him to a slightly bigger room in there. But he lived very simply. And the reason that he decided that this was the better place for him to live is he said it was because he wanted to be around people. And he
Oh.
didn't want to be so isolated. And it was really important for him to be around people. And so that really, for me, that spoke to that Aquarius, Venus, and Moon, which are in pretty close conjunction to each other in his seventh house. And he's also got his Mercury in Capricorn in that seventh house as well.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, this is somebody that really does need that social engagement. He's got three planets in the seventh house. To me, that tells me that he is somebody who likes to see people eye to eye. He's
Mm-hmm.
not somebody that wants to be above people, which is funny because he's the Pope. So, it's
Mm-hmm.
like kind of in this elevated status, but at the same time, he chose as much as possible, it seems, to really meet people on a level playing field. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it's really reflective of that he decided to live in these guest houses and he took his meals in there because there's like a cafeteria in the building. So he also did his like daily mass, like his homily in that building. So he elected to just live in like a very different space than any other pope had ever lived.
I think that really speaks to, like, he's a Sagittarius, and when I think of Sagittarius, I think of like just like this expansive, like, I don't know, the word is out of my head, but like just like sometimes it's like that more is more is more quality, and
Mhm.
um indulgence, overindulgence, that's the word. That's kind of like that Sagittarius word, but he's ruled by that Capricorn Jupiter. And so I think that really kind of helps keep him grounded in a way, and like really kept him humble and kind of like reeled in some of that like Sagittarius expansiveness.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I viewed it. Just like that combination of Sagittarius with the Capricorn.
Yeah, I feel like with a Sagittarius sun, like he could be this really indulgent person, but we see
Hmm.
over and over in descriptions of how he lived his life, even before he was Pope,
Hmm.
that he lived this very monastic life, which to me really speaks to that Jupiter in Capricorn. It's
Hmm.
like he idealized the rigor and the simplicity and like he's a leader. And so I think for him, being even just a priest, as a priest you are a leader of your community,
Hmm.
that he could kind of set an example in a certain way through the simplicity of his life, which
Hmm.
I think he really, like, it doesn't seem like he ever really gave that up, because even when he was made archbishop in Buenos Aires, he like there's another, residence for archbishops that he elected not to live in. And he cooked a lot of his meals, he took public transit. So, by all accounts that I have read, he lived very modestly, like the entire time,
Hmm.
which I think is really
Yeah.
hard to do, especially when you're like gaining authority, in this church. And there, we know that there are a lot of corrupt people, within the church, because if you put authority into the equation, some people are not going to, honor honor
Hmm.
their vow of whatever. They're going to, defer to like, oh, I have power. What can I do with this power?
Yeah. I really feel like power, when people get power, that shows like who they really
Mhm.
are. And so, he always practiced what he preached, and even all the way up to the top.
He just seemed to want to live very, very simply. And it's like he had this focus, it seems. And I would put that partly back to, I mean, it's all over his chart, but I do think that having a Capricorn Mercury
Hmm.
is helpful in that sense. It's like he knew that he wanted to commit. I mean, it's a big a commitment as a young person to be like, I want to be a priest. I mean, you're making a lifetime commitment to not have a family, probably not have total control over a lot of aspects of your life. You work for God and in form of the Catholic Church, and it has some very strict rules and
Oh
expectations. So, this is a person with discipline and,
yeah. Hmm.
a strong desire to like be on his path, like from an early age. And it seems like he just knew that. And we were talking about before we hopped on that just overall looking at Pope Francis's chart, like this is a Pope chart. It's giving like born to be the Pope. And it's
Yeah.
funny because he's got a 25-degree Sagittarius Sun, but he's got a 24-degree Sagittarius North Node in the sixth house. It's giving born to be the Pope. It's giving, a life lived in service of what he believed.
Mm. Yeah.
It almost seems like he couldn't have helped but be of service in some way. That's what that tells me. It's such a close
Yeah.
it's such a close conjunction. Like he was born to put his beliefs into action.
I love that. Yeah. Well, and Sagittarius is like it's religion and teaching and
Hmm.
preaching. And I actually watched this documentary. We talked about this right before, but when he was about 19, I think he was like studying to become a doctor or something. But when he was about 19, he walked into a church and he was like so inspired by this priest that he's like, you know what, like that's what I want to do. And so, as we know, when we're 19, that's right around our nodal return. And so I think that was probably coincided with that or somewhere around there.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like sometimes when I think of nodes, I think of like more like fated moments. And so I think that was kind of one of those moments where like kind of like nudged him a little and he's like just was so inspired by it. So I don't know, that felt very I took note of that. As we know, sixth house is all about service and I think you said it just like it is just a lifetime of service and um with that being his son, I think it really fed his inner fire. Just like, some people reluctantly do it, but it just like came from this like deep desire to really be of service to people and help people in any way that he could. So,
Once he was a priest, he was a Jesuit, which is interesting to me because my non-Catholic perspective on Jesuits is that they are very into education
hmm.
and study, and that also my understanding, and I think we had some Jesuit priests at my high school. They were a little bit cooler than other non-Jesuit priests. I don't have an
Uh-huh.
explanation for that. Maybe you do.
I don't either. I do know that like there's different oaths that they take or something like that. I don't know. It's just kind of like a different branch.
Jesuits really do have this concern with education. And so it's interesting because his sixth house, not only, the Sagittarius, of course, he's the Pope, he was a priest, he's a preacher, all of
Hmm.
that, but he also spent a good amount of time teaching. He taught literature and psychology in a college, and he also taught in a high school. And so he actually was like a professor as well.
Hmm.
So I think that seems to reflect a lot in like how he speaks to people, because I feel like he was probably one of those professors that maybe got more down on his students' level, and he probably had some really interesting conversations because in his Pope years, this was something that he continued doing. There's documentaries of him talking to young people and talking about some of the issues that are challenging the church today with, queer rights and, uh, all kinds of things that have come up more recently for the church. And so he had these conversations as part of these documentaries. And I'm sure in his personal life as well. His choices as a pope, I think, reflect this kind of Jesuit commitment to education and like being of service. He seemed kind of like hardcore about that and his
Hmm.
commitment to poverty. His second house has got Neptune in it, and it's opposite that Saturn. It is giving, pretty strict, pretty it's getting like on a very literal level. It's like, well, that could be poverty.
Hmm.
He had this vow of poverty. What's interesting though is that his family immigrated to Argentina not because of economic reasons, according to his family. They were actually fleeing in the late 20s Mussolini.
Mhm.
So they were trying to escape fascism, and that's why they fled to Argentina. So it's interesting, I think, given his ministry and some of the things that he experienced later as a priest, one of the more controversial things that happened with him, and we don't really have all the details about it, is that there was a period of time where there was a dictatorship in Argentina, and he was a leader in the church at that moment, and people were getting disappeared, including priests and things like that. And so there were some controversial opinions about what he did or did not do. It doesn't seem like we have a lot of clarity about it, but there was criticism from some people that he didn't do enough to help other people as people were being disappeared by this regime.
Mhm.
And from what I can tell, he said that there were certain things that he didn't know, and I don't think we have all of the information on that, but there are some people that view him as somebody who didn't step up and do enough, which I would find surprising given the fact that his family came from the conditions that they did.
Right.
However,
Yeah.
the Catholic Church also has a history of complying with fascists. Unfortunately, I mean they did it with Nazi Germany. There's been others, so
Mhm.
you know the Catholic Church does not have clean hands in
No.
this sense. However, I don't know what he did in Argentina during this period of time.
It could have been like a epigenetics thing too, where or like family trauma where almost felt like he couldn't speak up because like maybe ancestors.
It's possible, but I also am wondering if he didn't do things behind the scenes
Mm-hmm.
and that we don't have documentation for. It is interesting because as Pope, he never returned to Argentina. And we don't know why that is, but he went to other places in South America. He did not go back to Argentina, which I find interesting because that was where he's from.
Mm-hmm.
So, who knows why that is, but that is one of the criticisms that, has been leveled against him. What he did say is that the Argentine Catholic Church needed to, quote, put on garments of public penance for the sins committed during the years of the dictatorship in the 70s. So, it sounds like he had his feelings about it. I would honestly be surprised if he wasn't doing something, maybe it wasn't enough, but if he wasn't doing something during this period of time when he knew that bad things were going down
Mm-hmm.
and that it was impacting, people he was serving.
Just because I do feel like he, not always, he's just a human and humans make mistakes, but it felt like he did try to always do like the right thing, um, especially in his like later years. I think it was like 2015. I can't remember. Maybe it was he traveled to Chile and like he
Mhm.
held a bunch of like bishops there accountable for like brushing things under the rug with like those pedophile priests and I think he fired all of those bishops.
There is an incident about that specifically that I think is worth talking about because one of the things that he messed up was at a certain point in his papacy, he was asked about sexual abuse allegations that were happening within the church. And it might have been in Chile specifically, so we may be talking about the same thing.
Hmm.
But he was talking about he hadn't seen any evidence. So that was the way that he kind of brushed off when he was asked that question. And I read an article after he passed from a journalist who was the one who prompted this line of questioning. And she said that his response was really not great.
Oh.
He was talking about evidence. And when
Hmm.
people were coming forward and talking about how somebody within the church leadership had sexually abused them,
Hmm.
and then he was talking about evidence, he later came back and I actually saw him on the plane with the microphone addressing media
Mhm.
about this, and he said that he used legal language in that moment and that it was the wrong choice of words. He regretted that he said that. And from everything that I could see, he kind of flipped the script on that one, regretted what he said, understood that in these situations, there may not be documentation of the sexual abuse. So he was asking for something that ultimately just made a lot of victims feel like shit. And he acknowledged that.
Mhm.
And he, from what I can tell, he turned a different page and he took this issue very seriously after this blunder.
Mhm.
I've seen a few times over the course of his papacy, at least, where he was did something that he people had a problem with, and then he actually reevaluated, which I think is kind of wild because a lot of times people in authority don't do that.
Mhm.
And he actually admitted fault and changed his behavior and then used the authority that he did have to do things better. Now, I think anybody who says that maybe he didn't do enough or he still had these, this or that in other areas where he had opinions that I don't agree with,
Mhm.
I think it's totally valid to be like it wasn't enough or whatever. But I do see this reoccurring thing with him where he reconsiders when he's told that something that he did was wrong or harmful,
Mhm.
and it's just kind of surprising for a pope.
That's where that power thing again, where it's like he had that power and he could have easily let it go to his head, but I don't think it ever went to his head. He was just, he saw himself as like everyone else, and I think that's part of his Aquarius moon again.
He's humble, I think, and he viewed that as a necessary part of life.
Something we haven't touched on yet is his Libra Mars. I just think that is a huge part of like, he's driven towards making the world like fair and just, and very much like a social justice person, and very driven towards that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting too. It's not really aspecting much in his chart. And if we have the right birth time, which we were talking about before we hopped on, that there's a possibility that this birth time is maybe slightly off. And in the birth chart that we are looking at the 9 p.m. birth chart, uh, the Mars is intercepted, which is interesting. But it's not really aspecting much, so it just feels like it's a big driver in his chart.
Yeah, I feel like when I see Mars in the third house, it's like a strong voice usually. Um, Not always. I have Mars in my third house, but I think maybe that was some of like the reluctance for like towards speaking up when he was like younger. Um, Maybe not always, but I don't know. Could be.
By all accounts, I mean, so if you're dealing with like fascism and things like that, you probably don't want to put a target on your back, especially when they're drugging priests and things like that. There were some really ugly things happening. So I would imagine, laying low is probably a good idea if you want to be effective. And, according to him, he gave papers that he had that a person that looked like him used to escape Argentina during that time. So it may be that he was able to fly under the radar a little bit more and kind of engage with that drive for justice and helping people in a way that was a little bit more subtle to the point of being controversial. So that could be one explanation for it. Let's talk about his 10th house because this is part of the reason why we were questioning his birth time. So, on the chart that we're looking at, he has a 0-degree Taurus MC, which could be the case. That could be his MC, but it's interesting. I'm a Cancer rising also. So, when I was thinking about his legacy, he was a first in so many ways for the Catholic Church. And so, it would make sense for it to have been an Aries MC. He was somebody who broke a lot of barriers in the Catholic Church. He kind of did things as a pope a bit differently. And so that was my thinking about it. But the chart we have 0 degree Taurus, and I think that that also can make sense as well. So I could see it kind of going either way, which isn't the most helpful, but I'm going to use the Taurus because that's the chart that we have. But he's also got that Uranus in there, which we've mentioned before, and it's retrograde, which is interesting. I think that to me speaks to his, like, the Taurus of it all and the Uranus of it all. It's interesting because those two energies are quite different. Like the Taurus energy and the Uranian energy, you wouldn't necessarily like put those two together if you were just arranging things astrologically. But there is this like calm, I think, that we saw with Pope Francis. And the 10th house is about our reputation and how we look in public wielding our authority, essentially. So this is him as Pope, I think, is one of the ways we can look at his 10th house. And he seemed extraordinarily level in a lot of ways, and almost like not unemotional, but like placid in a way that does kind of give me that Taurus MC vibe. One of the things that Taurus MCs can have that's kind of a benefit is that things might look easier for them than they actually are. They kind of look unbothered, when they're potentially bothered. So that could be, I think that potentially is reflective of Pope Francis, because like he didn't really seem to be bothered even when people asked him questions that he didn't give good answers to. Like I never saw him snap at people. I'm sure that he did. He's a human, but uh just the way that he kind of carried himself in that role did have this very like calm, unshakable type of demeanor that feels very Taurus.
Yeah, I think just like a very soothing presence. I think some of that is probably his Cancer rising too, just very like nurturing. People feel comfortable around him for sure. But yeah, I do think that Uranus in his 10th house is very strong and very loud. Um, I think that really speaks to his like, progressive, revolutionary, humanitarian legacy that he's leaving behind.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting watching all the documentaries that I've been watching in preparation for this episode. I really was thinking a lot about that Taurus MC, because when you're doing the astrology of a public figure, right, we don't get to sit and have conversations with them the way that we do with our clients. So that, as astrologers, I think it's a little bit of a blind spot for us, because when you have a dialogue with somebody, you're going to get deeper into what their astrology is kind of translating into in their life. Whereas when you're talking about public figures, we're really seeing their 10th house loud and clear. And the other stuff is like, kind of what we can put together with limited information, just the information that's public, essentially. So we really do see his 10th house like loud and clear above the rest of his charts, the top of the charts, kind of how it works. But uh, the more that I listened to him talk, I was like, okay, I think I can accept the possibility of this 0 degree Taurus MC. And one of the reasons why I came to that conclusion is because he talked a lot about how the gospel has so much to do with poverty. Taurus is also a sign that is concerned with resources, money, things like that. And it's funny because this is a man that had a vow of poverty, and his MC is 0 degree Taurus. It's like pure, pure resource energy, right? And
Zero
so,
dollars.
what's that?
$0.
$0, literally $0, 0 degree, $0. And I was thinking about how he spent a lot of his time talking about how the church was supposed to be for the poor. He really felt that that was the purpose of the church. And he also said no one can serve two masters. We can serve God or we can serve money. So he viewed it as a bit of a binary thing. And his focus on resources feels very Taurus MC to me, because that's what he used his power to do, is to talk about poverty, to talk about marginalized people that didn't have resources. And so his he had a very strong philosophy about not finding your security in material resources. He felt that that was, not a strong foundation to build yourself up on. And of course, he had his personal, relationship to that, and that for him was an important part of how he lived his life. So in some ways, it's like he celebrated poverty in a sense as a rejection of the material world in certain ways. And he talked a lot. It's really interesting because I'm not a Catholic. I'm not somebody that was like particularly obsessed with this or any pope, but as far as popes go, I never expected to be watching documentaries about a pope and nodding my head like, yeah, yeah, he's right. He's right. And so much of his conversations about money and resources, and he talked about people being slaves to work in this reality, like things that I've said on this podcast, the Pope was saying. And I was kind of struck by that. And I think you're totally right that that Uranian energy in there also played into that heavily, because his fixation with resources was not just personal, it was collective, which is that Uranian energy. He was very fixated on what resources could do for people and what not having those resources and what having a world so focused on people working for their resources had done to people in a moral sense. So I found that really, I was shocked how much I really connected to his messages about those things. One of the things that he did as Pope was he created a forum of farmers, workers, and indigenous people. And that was partly to focus on, workers' rights. That was something that was really important to him. And I would also put that back to that 10th house and the Taurus MC and the Uranus in there. He was somebody who made this a focus, and he also cared about the environment, and he viewed indigenous rights as a vehicle to serving the environment, because of course indigenous people, what makes indigenous people indigenous is their relationship to a particular land, and having a reciprocal relationship to that land and being of service to that land uh, was really an important thing for him. There was a really great quote from that Wim Wenders documentary where he talked about how when we create in the world, when we do things in the world, uh, we're imitating God because we're creating. And I thought that was a really, really fascinating view of like how creation, like doing things in the world, participating in the world, using your hands and making things. It's like he viewed work and being of service as almost like holy things in the sense, because it was godlike. And I found that really interesting. He also talked about saying no to an economy of exclusion and inequity, where money rules instead of serving. He said the economy was destroying the earth, literally. Like he was very blatant about these things. And I think one of the things that kind of sets the papacy apart from other world leaders, as he's talking about these things, I was thinking like, man, any other leader saying these things would be so remarkable, but he is a religious figure, so he doesn't serve a country, he serves beyond borders. And I think that was partly why he could see these things so clearly. Is he's not, the head of a state, right? He's the head of a people that are international and have all kinds of ranges of issues, and so he didn't limit himself from talking about things like the economy in the way that he did, which I found really remarkable. But the other side to that is that the Catholic Church is one of the biggest real estate holders in the world. It's one of the richest entities in the world. So, like a lot of things with Pope Francis, it's like I really appreciate his words and the changes that he made and the things that he did with his time. But at the same time, I'm like, I agree with you on all these things, but what about the church giving back their resources to the indigenous people that they stole it from, that they built these residential schools that cause so much harm? Like, there's an extra step I think that could have been taken. And who knows if he had the full power to do that. I would assume that the Pope can do some things, and he definitely seems to have tried. But it seems like there's a disconnect to me between some of these things that he was saying, which I'm like agreeing with, but at the same time, I'm like remembering, the Pope is the representative of the Catholic Church, which has all of these resources, which have in part been claimed through colonization.
Yeah, it's like he almost got it.
And he even for the things that he did say and do, there was quite a bit of pushback. There was even some cardinals about a year ago that got together and they had some issues with him. So he was controversial even within the Catholic Church, even though he didn't like push as far as like I would have liked him to have. But for what he did within the Catholic Church, he's the most progressive pope that we've ever had.
Oh, yeah.
And that I think speaks to that Uranian energy. It's his own brand of leadership. He didn't just do what everybody else was doing. And in fact, he upset the apple cart in a lot of senses. Like his authority was irritating to people. And that's Uranian energy for you, because some people are going to get it and some people are not going to get it. And either way, change is going to be made. And so I think that that 10th house Uranus, like I'm convinced that regardless of what time he was born, that Uranus is in there, because uh, he really was progressive for Catholic Church standards.
And it's interesting that it's like all that Taurus energy is ruled by his Aquarius Venus. So it's
Right.
kind of like a double whammy.
Yeah, exactly. Like there is his authority. I think for him, I don't think that he considered it just personal. I think he used it for collective benefit. After his passing, a lot of people have a lot to say about his legacy and what he did do and what he didn't do. A lot of queer people wrote about this pope, which I was surprised by, but also not surprised by, because I think in terms of popes, this is the one that queer people, we have something to say about. And so he had some moments where he said things that pissed people off because they were a little bit too progressive. He said that queer couples should be able to be blessed by priests, but he made it very clear that this was not marriage. He was not pro gay marriage. He had some issues with that. He actually, back in his Argentina days, he was against some legislation that had to do with same sex marriage there, but he was in support of civil unions. He just had this very strong divide between marriage as a sacrament, as a vehicle for getting closer to God in the eyes of the Catholic Church. He was very strict about like no 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 queer people are going to get married in my church. So on some things he like really towed the line. Another thing that he towed the line on, he was pretty harsh, I think, in certain ways about being transgender. And it's very interesting because this is like a recurring theme for Pope Francis, is that he says things that are important and progressive and actually piss a lot of people off that are more conservative and traditional. But at the same time, you look at what he actually did and instituted, and it leaves you wanting if you are a progressive person, I think. So it's an interesting contrast because, how progressive can you be as Pope of the Catholic Church? So, but he said that transgender people were playing God essentially by transitioning, and that was his feeling about the whole thing. But in contrast, towards the end of his life, he was meeting with transgender Catholics like once a month, which I think is pretty remarkable for a pope to be engaging that directly. And he really felt strongly about hearing them out and listening to their stories. So, ultimately, it doesn't sound like it changed too much for him, but at the same time, it's hard to ignore like the fact that a pope was, regularly meeting with trans people. There was actually at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, he donated money to uh, trans sex workers there was an organization that needed financing, and obviously 2020 there was a lot of tumultuous, a lot of people needed money. A lot of people still need money, but he actually contributed financially to them and met with them subsequently multiple times. And so it's really interesting because consistently throughout his life, we see him interacting with people like much like my impression of Jesus would have been, is that there were literally no boundaries, it seems like, to the people that he would meet. I mean, he met with heads of state who were doing war crimes, so I don't see I don't see, like, to me that's more offensive than meeting with queer people that are, not okay in the eyes of the church. One of the famous quotes that he had about gay people is that it really wasn't his place to judge. That was one of his big quotes about the whole thing, is that, if people were queer and searching for God, his impression was, who am I to judge? So even though for queer people that's probably like not much, for a pope that's a huge deal. For a pope that's a huge deal. And also even the fact that he used the word gay was a big deal, because typically popes would use homosexuals. And so there was kind of this interesting mix with him where, with that Aquarian energy, you really see him trying to embrace all people. And that Aquarius Venus, it really feels like that's what that is about. And, again, it's in the seventh house. So it feels like he was trying to form connections and really meet people where they're at, regardless of whether or not he felt that their lives matched up with the way that the Catholic Church would want them to live. And that's not nothing to me. It's not nothing to me, given given how harsh the church has been, given how, like in the United States, there are a lot of people that are religious who have a severe hatred of queer people, and especially trans people. And so for him to meet them with dignity, he made it very clear that he didn't believe in criminalizing trans people or homosexuals. So that is huge, which is sad. It's kind of sad, but that's an important thing, and it's a big difference from Protestants in the United States right now, at least. So I can dig it. I understand that it's not enough, but um, I think it's pretty remarkable for somebody in strict Catholicism in their late 80s.
Yeah, I mean, like even when I was in like grade school and middle school, like I think I was probably around like 13, 14 when I decided like, maybe this whole Catholicism thing not for me. And it was that whole like anti-gay thing that like really really was why I was like this is not for me, like because it just didn't make sense to like the teachings and how like we're meant to like love thy neighbor, but like not if they're gay. Like that just never made sense to me. And so to see it like even in my lifetime progress to what it is because of Pope Francis, a little refreshing.
Well, another thing that he did that was pretty remarkable is that he said that gay Catholics are made and loved by God. And he told families of queer youth that God loves your children as they are. This is actually, I think, one of the biggest things he did for me, like as a queer person, because there are a lot of families that are strictly religious. And so to have the Pope come out and say, don't abandon your children if they come out as queer, I think that's actually a huge deal. It may not be enough, but I think that's a step in the right direction for a lot of people, as we can see, that are really struggling and also being politically charged to hate queer and trans people specifically. So for him to say, love your kids regardless of who they are in this context, I think that's actually a really massive thing, and probably one of the more helpful things that he could say to his flock, essentially, because it's a normal thing to do. You hear about it all the time. There are plenty of queer people that don't have relationships with their families for these reasons. So to me, that's a really uh, big thing for him to do. Well, and it's also interesting too, given the Uranus in that 10th house, that so much of the focus, whether people liked him or disliked him, had to do with his relationship to queer people. The conservatives thought he was doing too much. The people who are actually queer oftentimes didn't feel that he was doing quite enough. And so it's funny that his 10th house, like his legacy in some sense, may be identified with the way that he kind of weighed in on these issues. Uranus is the disruptors. It's changing of expectations. So it's a very queer energy to me, uh, the Uranus energy. So I think it's kind of funny that that's where it landed in his chart.
I was just thinking he's very Uranian.
He is very Uranian. For the Catholic Church, so much seems to revolve around reproduction, right? Which is very smart. If you're the Catholic Church, it's like, well, we got to keep this thing going, so we need these Catholics to make more Catholics, and that's how they've lasted for thousands of years, right? So this focus on the family is very interesting to me because it does come up when you read about his views on queer relationships, on transgender people, because so much of his focus on those things has to do with this adherence to the traditional idea of family. So it's so interesting to me that somebody so Uranian, someone so progressive in a lot of ways, at the same time, I would put that back a little bit to that Cancer rising. There is this respect for the family unit, which is just kind of funny to me, given that priests are asked to kind of give that up as part of their service. So it's like he himself didn't get to have a family of his own, but he was certainly part of his like family of origin. And it sounds like his upbringing and having that connection to his family, they sound like they were pretty close. So, for him, I think that it was not something that he could personally relate to, but at the same time, he seemed to really understand this place of like the nuclear family in continuing the tradition of Catholicism and like the social importance of like honoring the family. He was actually against queer people adopting children. Like that was something that was too far for him. So it's interesting that he was like, these people are not criminals. However, they shouldn't have kids. It is kind of more traditional, and in Cancer energy can be traditional like that. It can be, I don't want to go out of my comfort zone. I don't want to be disturbed. I don't really want to have to question things a little too much. And so it's interesting contrasting that with his Uranian Aquarian energy. There was both in there. There was the conservatism, the tradition. And some people described him when he was elected as Pope. He was considered somebody that had a little bit more of a conservative approach to theology. So it's funny. It's a funny mix of both. And and again, yeah, like he was considered progressive and by some people way too progressive for the Catholic Church. Pretty much immediately, like even when they announced him as Pope, they take him out to the balcony and people are like waiting, and the way he presented himself was also different. He didn't wear some of the ornaments that are normally worn. He actually he wore that white vestment that he wears quite a lot, and he elected to have a more simple cross versus like a gold cross that they normally would wear. Like normally they would wear this kind of red thing on top of their outfit for this announcement. So he really like the simplicity and the focus on like the job was a really strong part, like just from the moment he got in there. It's like he just continued being himself in a lot of ways, which is funny because I feel like Aquarian energy, I mean, and certainly Capricorn energy can be really really stubborn. Both of those signs are ruled by Saturn. So this is somebody that I don't think that they probably I would bet that they probably tried to talk him into doing some things differently, and he probably had to say no. I mean, even this dedication to simplicity and living spiritually, it's interesting because his Saturn in Pisces is in the eighth house, and he elected to be buried in a simple coffin, not in the place that most popes choose to be buried. And he also was buried in his like regular shoes that he wore, that he walked around and met people in. And uh, again, rejecting this ornamentation that often comes with being the Pope. I mean, even in death, like that was part of his wishes. And I feel like that Saturn in Pisces is so like it is mystical, and it's like aesthetic in a certain way. It does really kind of give Francis of Assisi vibes to me, Saturn in Pisces, right? It's like using your authority as a reflection of your connection to all things, including God, including the land. It's like he really had this like intimate understanding of the relationship between like the degradation of the environment and people working all the time, and losing focus on, what's actually important, and becoming more focused on money in the material world, which for him was like the opposite of what we're here to do. It's like we're spiritual beings here to live a spiritual life. And, that Saturn and Pisces opposite Neptune, it's just like, I really feel that he viewed any authority that he was given as a gift from God, and as a reflection of God. And like that beautiful quote that he gave about how being a creator, creating, doing things, is imitating God. That was his perspective, and I really feel like that speaks to that part of his chart really strongly. For by him, it was like all authority comes from God. So it seems like he viewed himself and others as hands of God. Pope Francis said during an interview one time that he fell asleep during prayer, and the interviewer asked him whether that was allowed. And he said that fathers always love it when their children fall asleep in their arms, which I thought was so sweet, because I think for him, he really viewed himself first and foremost. This also speaks to his Cancer rising as a child of God.
I mean, his faith was just like so unshakable, and everything he said with like this like complete 100% confidence, which I think could be part of that like Pisces Saturn.
One of the things towards the end of his life that I really appreciate him for, and I think this is where, for me, most of my admiration for Pope Francis comes from the fact that he was one of few people in the world who were leaders, who have this tremendous platform and authority to say that what was happening to Palestinians was terrorism. And he received a lot of criticism for that. But one of the things he said was like, why them and not me? Viewing himself as, viewed himself as a child of God, but he understood that he's not the only one, like he understood himself as part of a family. And in fact, he talked a lot about viewing one another when he gave his talks about viewing one another as brothers and sisters. He really viewed people as siblings, and that we should regard each other as human beings, as siblings. And I feel like that is also that very Aquarian energy, very Saturn and Pisces. Like, I don't know, it just really feels like there is no authority but God. And it really does feel like God is, I mean, in the church, God is the Father. And I think that he, in a kind of a literal sense, viewed us all connected in this environment as, God made the earth. All of it is a product of God. It all kind of goes back to God, and therefore we're all connected. And you really hear that when he speaks. And I think his discussions about what's happening in Gaza and calling it terrorism, and saying why not me, just understanding that the things that happen to us in life and the injustices that we might be subject to can feel so random, and like nobody deserves to endure a genocide. And he understood that like it was purely by chance of birth that he was not living under such conditions. And so I really feel like his connection to the collective of humanity, but also to all things, is really really evident, not only in his chart but also in the way he lived his life. And one of the beautiful things that we discovered recently is that after his death, he wanted the Pope Mobile that he would be driven around in to be turned into a clinic for children in Gaza. So he also, like, there is a small Catholic church in Gaza, and apparently every night he would call that congregation and speak to them. And he was very intimately, I think, connected to what was happening there and horrified by it. And, when you talk about 1.4 billion people that call themselves Catholics, I think it means something for the leader of the church to say these things and to do these things and to actually like put his money towards these things. Another thing that we didn't even mention, because there's so much to talk about in terms of like how simply he lived his life, but he rejected the Pope gets a salary that's not too, it's not unlike what the president of the United States gets. It's a pretty sizable amount of money. He didn't accept it. In fact, had it redistributed to causes that he believed in. He didn't take that money. So in terms of him and his life of service, it's like he seems to really have embodied that in every way and like redirected material resources to these causes and putting his time into this and to supporting his church in Gaza and saying the things that he did, speaking the way that he spoke. Another thing that I really admire about him is that he was pretty harsh. He cared a lot about migrants, and he actually really understood, I think, the connection between climate crisis and migrants, because it's true, because as the climate continues to degrade, more and more natural disasters are going to happen and people are going to continue to be displaced. And unfortunately, because the world does revolve around money, as he was very aware of, a lot of migrants are coming from the global south, places that have been economically marginalized, if not outright harmed by the West and the United States. And he was very, very clear about we should embrace migrants. I mean, the gospel is very clear about it. This should not be controversial for any Christian. I don't care if you're Catholic or not. I was always baffled as a child, like that I was the political stuff that I was seeing people in the church do really didn't make any sense to me. And that's why I stopped being a Christian as a child. I was like, this makes no sense. And I don't like you people, and I don't like the way that you interpret things, and why are you acting like that? To me, I was watching Christians do like satanic shit, which to me was, not caring about marginalized people and in fact piling on the oppression. Stuff like that really um, disturbed me, and I think it really disturbed Pope Francis as well, because this was a continual thing that he talked about. And it happened a lot while he was Pope. There were different, boats of migrants that would capsize and people would drown, and like people would reject taking these migrants in, closing the borders. He was very uh, blatant, I think, about the Trump administration. He wrote a letter to American Catholic leadership talking about how the gospel is very clear about how we treat migrants and refugees. And he came at the Trump administration and JD Vance, who is a Catholic, a recent convert, pretty clearly. He was like, this is unacceptable. And he said explicitly he felt closing borders hurt both migrants and the people within a country, which I agree with. And it feels also very Aquarian. It's like, we need the difference. We need people to not all be the same. He also said, another very Aquarian quote, differences make us grow. Uniformity doesn't make us grow, so it doesn't scare us. Differences are creative. They create tension, and resolving this tension moves humanity forward. And I really feel like, going back to that quote that I mentioned in the beginning from that nun who said that we get the Pope that meets the moment. The Pope is a representative of that particular time in the church. And I do feel like Pope Francis seemed to really embody and kind of take these issues of this moment head on, as we are seeing so much hatred towards queer people, towards immigrants. Those are two of the things that I think his legacy will really reflect. And he does reflect this moment. And he made his views on those things very clear, that hate was not the right way, and that it didn't have any place in his church, at least. He was really here to be of service, and he viewed that service, to not be something that was only Catholics, or only people in XYZ club. That he had that very Aquarian, very universal type of approach to things. And I think people really noticed. I've never seen so many non-Catholics lament the death of a pope before. Never. And, a lot of people have complicated feelings about him, as I do too. When people come across that energy, then they can identify you as somebody who is somebody of service, who isn't going to discriminate against people just because of XYZ reason, is going to just meet them as children of God, right? And how valuable that is for people. Like, just watching people, tears streaming down their face because they got to interact with, he's just a man, he's a man. He's the head of the Catholic Church, but he's a man. And, for somebody like him who did live so humbly, I could see him rejecting it. But it seemed like I really got the sense that he understood the power of that. And instead of making it about him, it just seems like he allowed himself to be a vessel, if that makes sense. And I think, human beings, leadership, I think, is still really important for human beings. And like having people that are agents of God, whatever way, whether you're an astrologer or whether you're the Pope, right? Like that is such a valuable contribution to humanity. Like we can, our life can be our service. You don't have to be the Pope to be of service in the way that he was. And part of how he achieved that, I think, was really just loving people in showing up for them. And so that really like kind of touched me and made me reflect on, my own agency in this world, and like how I am of service, and that it's something bigger.
Yeah, I think a lot of that, I mean, not like this is the only part in his chart, but I think a lot of it goes back to that Saturn in Pisces. It's just like that spiritual authority. And I think with Pisces, it comes like with this empathetic and compassionate understanding. And, I always talk about our Saturn placement as like what we're kind of working towards in a way. Like we have to master that in our lifetime. And I think a lot of like his life journey led to kind of mastering these spiritual things. And I also wonder about like his boundaries, because like Saturn's also boundaries, and having that kind of attention, and like all of those people, like, and seeing people in all different kinds of situations, like I feel like that would really affect me in a way. So I
Mm-hmm.
wonder what kind of boundaries he had in place, and if those were like, it's in God's hands or whatever. But
I bet that because it's funny that you just said that, because that's what I was thinking, is that he probably handed it over to God. Like I think he really did understand his limitations as like a human. And it's just an interesting contrast, like to be the Pope and be like, but I'm just a guy. But I think that that's just kind of how he seemed to live his life, is like, yeah, like I'm just a guy. So if you look at kind of the lineup for people who are potentially in the running for becoming the next Pope, there are a couple of more progressive options. People who don't fucking hate gay people, and some who have kind of a similar down to earth, one of the people type of vibe. So it would be really great if that legacy could continue after Pope Francis, and that we don't get somebody who's going to, fan the flames of fascism that are happening right now, because that would be very throwback to World War II.
literally.
My hope is that with the energy that we have going on right now, Neptune is in Aries for a little bit and will be throughout this conclave, unless something really wild happens. But I think most of these conclaves now are just a few days.